everyone, welcome to CropsTV. I'm Catherine DeLong, the Water Quality Program Manager for Iowa State Extension Outreach. And today I'm going to be talking about how to use your land, how to use your natural resources to increase return on investment. And we could have that conversation in lots of different ways because there are lots of ways that your natural resources can work for you. But today we've chosen to focus on 3 farmer case studies. So we've had conversations with 3 different farmers in Iowa about how they're using their natural resources to make their land more resilient. So I'm going to kick things off by choosing a farmer who has done a lot of practices focused on water quality. And then I'm going to pass it off to Billy Beck, who will focus on a farmer who's integrated trees into his land, as well as followed by Adam Jenke, who will be talking about some farmers who have introduced habitat onto their farms. So for my case study, I chose to focus on Mark Schleisman. Mark lives in Calhoun County near Lake City, and he is less than half a mile from the Raccoon River. And my background is in soil science, and so where Mark lives is actually really interesting to me because if you can see on the map, that little yellow star is where Mark lives. And so at one point, all of Iowa was covered in glaciers. But the most recent glaciation was right about where Mark lived. There were 3 different advances of that glacier, and the second advance stopped right where Mark's house is. And so the glacier stood there for a while and it melted. And so it makes it a very interesting landscape, but it also means that it's a little bit rocky and it's a little bit sandy where he lives. So Mark farms about 5,000 acres with 3 family members. His main crops are popcorn, so popping corn that he sells to ConAgra to be sold to movie theaters, as well as seed popcorn. And then he also grows soybeans and field corn. He also raises cow-calf pairs, as well as hogs that he owns from wean to finish. So one of the things that's most interesting about Mark's operation is his use of cover crops and small grains. So like I mentioned, Mark owns 5,000 acres, and he plants cover crops on every single acre every single year. But of course, he did not start out that way. Like most people, he started out planting cereal rye on a few acres. His primary mix is cereal rye with rapeseed, and he chose that mix because his main goal with cover crops is grazing for his cattle. But he changes up that mix depending on his goal for that field. So if he has compaction in that field, he might introduce radishes. If he knows he's only going to fall graze, then he might add a winter kill cover crop like oats. And he has this great quote: "When it comes to cover crops, I have a whole crop plan. Just like my corn and soybeans, what we plant will be influenced by if we're going to graze in the fall, spring, or both." So he changes it up depending on what that field needs and what his cattle need. He also raises small grains. So he grows triticale and cereal rye to harvest seed, as well as using it for bedding and silage. And so I mentioned that one of the main ways that Mark increases his return on investment through cover crops is through grazing. And he participated in a research study with Practical Farmers of Iowa where they looked at the amount of forage that he was producing for his cattle compared to the cost of cover crops. And they found that he was actually making a profit of $48 to $60 per acre. And that does include cost share. So he did receive federal cost share to work with cover crops. But even without cost share, he is still making $27 to $28 per acre. And you can see that in the last part of that figure. Mark also grows a majority of his cover crop seed. So I said he has 5,000 acres that he puts cover crops on. So that is a lot of cover crop seed, and that's a lot of money that he's saving. He also grows triticale and cereal rye as small grains. And so when I say small grains, that means that he plants them in the fall, like a cover crop. They grow throughout the year, and then they're harvested in July. And then he follows that with a summer annual like forage sorghum or sorghum Sudan grass. And then the sorghum is again harvested. So he's getting 2 crops out of those acres. And then he also uses the straw for bedding and the winter for silage. Another way that he's seeing return on investment is he's increased the carrying capacity of the land. He has this great quote, "My dad ran 200 cow-calf pairs on the same acres that we now run 360 pairs. Because of cover crops, we are producing more on less land." Mark also custom seeds cover crops for his neighbors. He has a high clearance machine that allows him to plant into standing crops. So he can get his cover crops started early because, again, one of his goals is fall grazing. So he can change up that machine depending on what his needs are. It also has a detasseling bar, a mail row destroyer bar, and a sprayer boom. So he uses that one machine throughout the season, throughout every season, throughout the year. He also uses cost share. Cover crops have been good for his bottom line, but he also recognizes that they have water quality and societal benefits. And so he takes advantage of federal cost share through the NRCS Environmental Quality Incentives Program. And then he has, just to sort of sum up what he's seeing, cover crops for us with grazing cows, it started out as a no-brainer, where we grazed because we saw an immediate impact on the bottom line. But then we started to see the soil health, and that's why we've spread it to every acre that we farm now. So this presentation is really focused on the dollars and cents, but by using cover crops, Mark is also increasing his soil health. So he's building on those benefits, and so he's probably seeing increased infiltration that allows him to get into the field earlier. Perhaps he's increasing his organic matter, which is leading to a higher available water holding capacity. So he's seeing benefits on benefits throughout the years. And then I also wanted to mention that Mark has pollinator and wildlife habitat. And I could try and sum up what he's done, but I think this quote really does it very well. "If I have an area in the field that's just not productive, I'll try to identify through yield maps and history those spots and see what program we can work with to enhance our overall returns instead of wasting inputs on a spot that's not productive." So he has about 95 acres that he has selected because he's spending more money on inputs in terms of fertilizer and herbicides than he is getting back from selling that crop. And so he's chosen to transition those row crop acres to native perennial habitat. And so again, he's focused this on marginal land. It's about 95 acres, so not a huge amount of land that he's taken out of production. And as far as return on investment, he again takes advantage of federal cost share to help pay for this. And he's also seen some increase in hunting habitat. He has seen more pheasants on his land. And Mark also says he's seen quail, which you'll hear from Adam in a little bit, but seeing quail north of I-80 would be really rare. So if he's seeing quail, it really speaks to the habitat that he's created on his land. And then I also wanted to mention that his average yield in those fields have increased because he's taken out these acres that were dragging his yield down, that were unproductive. Because those are no longer included in his yield averages, the overall yield average has gone up on those fields. And then the last suite of practices I wanted to mention are edge of field practices. So those are exactly what they sound like. They are practices that go on the peripheral of your field that have a great benefit for water quality and don't necessarily have any impact on your cash crop. So Mark has a saturated buffer. He has 4 bioreactors, and he also has drainage water recycling. So saturated buffers and bioreactors, these are practices that intercept tile drains before the tile outlets into a common water body. So it intercepts the tile, introduces it to a carbon source to help remove nitrate, this dissolved form of nitrogen, before it reaches our water bodies. And so he's got 4 bioreactors, but he's actually looking at adding 3 more. And he has seen his nitrate levels. They were 15 to 22 parts per million going into the bioreactor, and he's seeing them at 1 part per million leaving the bioreactor. So he is essentially taking out almost all of the nitrates before it reaches a common water body. And then the last thing I wanted to mention is drainage water recycling. So this is a demonstration and a research project that Mark is working on with Iowa State University and Iowa Soybean Association. And the idea is basically that they're putting in a wetland, and then they're using the wetland pool as the irrigation source for some of Mark's crop acres. He has seed corn, and so he does irrigate some of his acres. And so this is a new project. They're still sort of seeing if it's going to work out. But I wanted to include this because I think it's a good example of what conservation farmers are doing. They're being innovative, they're trying new things, and they're curious, and they're taking advantage of the latest technology. And I think Mark is a good case study of that. So I wanted to close it out with a quote from Mark. "We need to conserve the soil and wildlife, but also make money. We can be profitable and be a conservationist at the same time." All right, thank you. I will pass it over to Billy.
Hi, I'm Billy Beck, Extension Forestry Specialist with Iowa State University Extension Outreach, and I'm really excited to share my case study of the Kearney family and Kearney Family Farms. They're out of Polk County. They have a 300-acre rotational grazing operation that they transitioned from row crops a while back. This is such a cool case study because it really shows how they incorporated trees, forests, and forestry into their agricultural operation for not only economic gain, but to achieve all the other goals that they had for their land. And Bruce had a lot of great quotes here. Here's the first one I'm going to throw at you. He said, "Livestock need trees." And we'll get into the ways that trees can benefit livestock in a sec, but he has over 10,000 seedlings planted on his operation here. And as you'll see, it's not that great of a footprint taken out of production, and he doesn't view it as acres lost because of the disproportionately large benefits that the family gets from those planted tree practices. So a little bit of history on Bruce and his family. He returned to the farm in 1996, and he was really drawn to the livestock component. They had row crop and livestock at the same time, but he was really drawn to the livestock component for the following reasons. He said low inputs was the biggest part of that. To him, that was a great deal of freedom and independence, the low input agriculture, minimal use of chemicals, and also the potential to enhance soil and water quality by doing the livestock component. So kind of a neat history there with Bruce and his family. So their overall goals for the operation and the land, they had a lot. A big one that Bruce kind of said over and over when I was visiting with him was diversification of income. And then to him and his family, that meant resilience of any kind of swings in the economy that may come about. He also, here's the second great quote, he said stacked enterprises, and we'll get into that in a sec. He was really big on stacked enterprises. An example of that is in the far background there of that windbreak, where he also incorporated hardwoods, shrubs, and nut tree plantings. So it was not only blocking the wind to protect his cattle, but he had a source of diversified income for the future in the form of timber harvest, posts, fuel wood, and then nuts and other things for sale. Low input agriculture is a big priority for the Kearney family. Enhanced soil and water quality, enhanced wildlife habitat, and finally the learning opportunity experience for the family. He has a quote at the end there that I'll share, but really he said if his kids or grandkids have an idea, they're welcome to try it on the land and use that as a learning opportunity. So he's willing to try many different things, and I'm grateful that he did because he has a lot of neat forestry practices that not a lot of producers have in this neck of the woods. So here's a real quick shot of the Kearney operation, about 300 acres. Again, all rotational grazing. And I love this kind of shot because it really shows you the small footprint that the wide assemblage of tree and forest practices have on the landscape here. So they have windbreaks for cattle protection and soil erosion protection. They've got riparian buffers for water quality enhancement and that diversified income. They've got nut tree plantings. They've got an oak grove for timber and postwood. In the center there, you can see kind of his more dense windbreak. That's his extreme kind of feedlot there in extreme conditions, and I'll show you some photos there in a sec to protect the cattle. He's got CRP tree plantings for water quality enhancement. And lastly, he's got a practice that he's just starting to establish called silvopasture. And I'm not going to touch on that a lot today, but I'll task you with looking up silvopasture. It's essentially combining trees and livestock for the benefit of both entities. So very cool example here of wide range of things that are possible on acreages like this and the small footprint that they take up, of course, with that disproportionately large benefit to the overall agricultural enterprise. So a lot of opportunities with trees. And as Bruce says, trees are critical as far as achieving all those goals that we listed earlier. So I'm just going to go through these real quick. Windbreaks. I love windbreaks. Bruce does too. The family does too. These are essentially designed to protect livestock. That's their main role on their operation. So both winter and summer, they slow down wind velocities. Obviously in the winter, you want that feed going to weight gain and less towards just keeping the cattle warm. One big thing I'll mention about the carnies is they did incorporate a wide, diverse assemblage of tree species, mostly native species, in their windbreak plantings, not only for that diversified income, but also for things like wildlife habitat, diverse structure, and of course resilience against storm damage, insect and disease, and things like that. Shrubs, they are big on wildlife habitat. They've incorporated a number of native shrubs in their windbreak planting. So not only does that change up the structure, provide food and cover for different wildlife species, but if you know about windbreaks, those shrubs kind of act as the ramp, the start of the ramp there to get that wind up and over the practice. And again, back to stacked enterprises, that diverse species assemblage leads to a diversified income potential. Future timber harvest, fuel wood was a big one for the carnies there. And at the top, that top photo is one of the less dense windbreaks. So that's for his open paddocks that need kind of a lower degree of protection. So that would be where when the weather is not as extreme as it was, these past few winters. Those paddocks would be, he'd have his cattle out there when the weather is less extreme. The bottom photo is kind of his extreme weather protected paddock there with the more dense, wider windbreak. And I'll say something too about windbreaks that a lot of producers, cattle producers, livestock producers especially love is strategic placement of the windbreak can determine where snow is deposited and where snow is not deposited. And that can mean you keep that snow and that snow drifting out of those feedlot areas so you're not moving it and the cattle aren't in there messing around with it. Another great quote from Bruce, I think this is number 3. He states that trees act as a living barn for livestock, providing both winter and summer protection. We don't think a lot about summer protection, but shade, hot southerly summer winds can do some bad things as well. So this picture here, I was out visiting with him. He was actually moving the cattle from that extreme protected windbreak, the dense windbreak, when the temperatures were rising above single digits that day. And he was moving them out to a paddock that was protected by a less dense windbreak. But really for him, it's not just about kind of protecting the cattle, but obviously that leads to economic gains. It's not just like these folks are just not simply into trees. They like the beauty of them, which is great, but these trees do spell economic gains for these producers. So he was talking about the fact that they contribute to increased weight gains and reduced mortality since he's implemented these. And this is across the literature too. Just one example of a study found a 0.1 kilogram per day weight increase, cattle protected by a windbreak versus cattle that were unprotected by a windbreak. And it doesn't sound like a lot, but if you do the math and expand that over several hundred head every year, that adds up quite quickly. So agroforestry, this is a really neat topic. This is a very broad topic, so a lot of practices can fall under the term agroforestry. This is essentially incorporating trees and shrubs into either row crop or livestock enterprises to leverage both and be a benefit, an asset to both. Like Bruce said, it's a good way to sum it up. It's called stacked enterprises. You're getting the most that you can out of each acre by doubling up these practices. So they had a variety of these tree-related agroforestry practices around their property. They had nut plantings, not only for personal use, but for marketing in the future. Timber fuel wood, like we talked about before. They had an orchard for personal use. And then they were just starting that silvopasture practice, which I won't get into a lot, but it's essentially combining trees and livestock on the same acres for the benefit of both. So silvopasture is a really interesting practice there. So this is another one of his nut plantings there. So again, his big thing and the family's big thing was we want to get the most out of each acre, and we want to show our kids and our grandkids all that are possible on these acres. We can't simply just do one thing or a few things. There's multiple practices that we can have to diversify our income and promote resilience of our operation. So in the background is an agroforestry nut tree planting. Chestnuts, walnuts, and pecans. And again, this is a kind of region specific for these species. I always recommend reaching out to your professional forester for species recommendations, not only on where you are as far as in the state and region, but also the soil type you have and other things meeting your objectives for the species that are going to work for you. So this is a great example of added value from a tree resource. This was really neat. They had a big emphasis on water quality protection, and like I'll talk about, what I've talked about previously, it's not just for the the feel-good aspect of it. They actually saw an economic benefit from these practices that enhanced water quality. So amongst his paddocks and across his property, they had a series of alternative water sources designed to reduce cattle loafing time in the stream. So getting them up out of that stream and obtaining water elsewhere. So they had developed springs across the property. They had a gravity and well-fed supply network across the property. So each paddock had its own supply basin. They had controlled access points where cattle could access the stream, but it was rocked, so they weren't trampling the stream banks and roiling up the sediments and everything. And they had a great deal of stream fencing and, I'll add, riparian forest buffer to kind of block that stream corridor to prevent the cattle from accessing the majority of the length. And like many folks, he is doing his best to embrace the F word with fencing. There's challenges there, but he did receive cost share for it. That's a potential, and he has really seen an economic gain from fencing those cattle out, especially in the winter. He's seen less accidents, less mortality in the stream, and he's also seen less diseases like foot rot from reduced loafing time in the water. And all those windbreaks and tree practices that you see out there will eventually provide a good deal of shade, which act as alternative shelter to draw those cattle up out of the stream corridor, enhancing water quality. So you can see on this photo here, on the bottom right is a kind of developed basin where they can get fresh water without accessing the stream. And then they've got that series of linear stream fencing there, backed up with a riparian forest buffer, cost shared by the Conservation Reserve Program on the peripheral there. So just to close out, again, trees are a great asset to any agricultural operation, not only for the benefits that we normally think of like timber production and wildlife and aesthetics and beauty, but also to enhance the economic returns for your operation. So a lot of folks are curious on where to start. Here's some great links and resources here. Above all, I would suggest connecting with your professional forester and forestry contractors. Bruce had a professional forester work with him to design a whole farm plan for his tree resources, and he said that was critical to make those practices a success. And really quick, a professional forester does a lot with planning and administering things like timber sales, whereas forestry contractors can help you out with things like herbicide application, mowing, weed tree removal, things like that. They actually do the practices that the foresters prescribe. And we have a great contact feature on our website there that you can find who is actually serving your county. One kind of quick note for windbreaks, it's a little bit flipped. I would recommend contacting your USDA Service Center, the Natural Resources Conservation Service. They're the ones for the first stop for windbreaks here in the state of Iowa. And there's a lot of cost share for not only windbreaks, but other tree resources on your property. There's EQIP, the Environmental Quality Incentives Program. There's the Conservation Reserve Program. And lastly, there's REAP, the Resource Enhancement and Protection Program, which is actually quite flexible and a really nice program to incorporate and establish trees on the landscape. And of course, we've got our Extension Forestry website there at the bottom. So I implore you to think about trees and how they may act to become an asset for your agricultural enterprise. And with that, I'll see you.
Hi, my name's Adam Janke. I'm the Wildlife Extension Specialist here at Iowa State, and I'm going to be presenting our third and final case study in our exploration of farm resiliency and natural resources management across Iowa. So I'm actually taking a little bit of a different approach than what Catherine and Billy did, and I'm going to talk about a watershed level approach to environmental stewardship, improving farm profitability, and getting some wildlife benefits out of the deal along the way. And so what I'm going to look at is watershed in Boone County, south of Ogden, where a bunch of farmers and landowners have enrolled a bunch of wet areas in their crop fields into the Conservation Reserve Program. And in doing so, they've taken low-yielding areas in their field out of row crop production, increasing the overall profitability of the farm or the field, and creating a lot of grassland habitat along the way that me and some students have been doing some monitoring in over the last few years, and found a lot of birds and butterflies and plants and other animals have really taken advantage of it. So we're going to share with you this sort of case study to explore all the good that can happen, both for the farm, the landowner, and for the wildlife and water resources on our farms when we think creatively about where the field edges of our fields are drawn. So here's a picture of the watershed and some of the fields that we've been doing this monitoring in. And what you see here on this picture is the outline of the watershed itself. And this water then flows into the Des Moines River. And a bunch of fields. These fields are all just conventional corn and bean fields. And then all those blue areas are mapped with a mapping software that takes hydric soils, so soils that are not inclined to drain very quickly, like Okoboji soils, and then also a topography map, so areas where water is inclined to pool, and it predicts where these wet areas in the crop fields will be. So those are those blue areas, and then you see everything that I have traced in yellow is the area where the blue areas have been taken out of crop production, put into the Conservation Reserve Program, and that's where we've been doing this monitoring. And so in this watershed itself, there's 25 unique depressions that are being managed with native perennial grasses, 398 acres of perennials, ranging the small patches, those yellow boxes range from 6.3 to 108 acres. And we'll zoom in on a couple of them and show you what exactly they look like. This is taking advantage of this phenomenon that we know plays out across Iowa, and that is that some areas within our conventional crop fields, our quarter sections or half sections or however we draw our field boundaries, are just consistently not profitable. This study from Iowa State that was published in 2018 estimated that around 12% of all of Iowa's cropland acres lose money, $100 per hectare per year, between 2012 and 2015. And so these are the types of areas that people like me and Catherine and Billy and a bunch of others that you learn from through CropsTV and elsewhere are really excited about finding opportunities for improving environmental stewardship on the farm and also improving farm profitability. So a win-win opportunity area. And so these wet areas in the crop fields that I introduced in this watershed in Ogden are one of these hotspot win-win opportunity areas that we're really excited about. Now, sophisticated technology can tell you where these are in your field, or I always say you know where they are because you drive the combine or you drive the planter and you know where these problem areas exist. On the Des Moines lobe, which is where we've been focusing most of our discussion today, we find them most commonly where the glaciers left what we call upland depressions. And so these are areas where hydric soil conditions have emerged and the water is inclined to not drain very quickly, and it doesn't have a natural surface outlet. But other areas on your farm that may be consistent profit loss areas, maybe like eroded hillsides, they may be along rivers and streams, that areas that are inclined to flooding, like Catherine mentioned in her case study, or even odd areas like old barn lots or compacted areas along the margins of the field that just see the traffic of the combine and grain carts and other equipment every single year, year after year. All these areas are the places where we expect there to be consistent loss of profitability within the field that may be a candidate for reimagining where the boundaries of the field could be drawn to create better environmental outcomes and better overall field profitability. So here's a zoomed in example of one of the fields that was in that watershed that I was showing you before. Here you can see zoomed in again those blue spots that are the wet soils that are inclined for water to pool, and the yellow areas where the landowner has enrolled the parcels in the Conservation Reserve Program. Now, in this case, the Conservation Reserve Program practice that's being used is called the Farmable Wetlands Program. And so that's a combination of two different conservation practices, CP27 and CP28. And they have, of course, like all of those Farm Bill programs, have specific enrollment requirements. But that's how it is that they arrive at these specific boundaries that sort of fit the needs of this farm. And they establish native perennial vegetation, so native warm season grasses, wildflowers, and other prairie plants in these field areas. And then you can see that they were also considering the farmability of the field as they were designing them. So they did a really nice job of sort of squaring up the margins of these wet areas and centering, for the most part, on the problem spots within the field so that you could still effectively farm around the outsides and then not have to traffic across the wet spots every year where you're losing the crop most consistently. And so here, this is a half section field, and what remains is a 310 acre field and 62 acres enrolled in the CRP in those 4 different parcels. Here's what that field, this is the exact same field here that I'm toggling between. And this is just a picture that we took with our drone this last growing season. And you can see how nice and square those CRP areas are. You can even pick out from this drone image the wet areas in the field where you kind of see that more lush vegetation. Those are the consistent problem areas. And you can see how the rest of the field looks pretty homogeneous and looks like it's in pretty good shape. And so this is sort of the exciting aerial view of this creative rethinking of these field edges that we can see on this farm. Now, this is what gets the bird biologists like me excited, and that is we've been visiting these areas, not just those 4 that I just showed you, but about a dozen other fields about that size in this area south of Ogden. And we found in our monitoring 22 different species of birds breeding in these grassland areas in the middle of crop fields. And what I always like to remind people when we talk about this project is that these are birds that would not nest in a crop field, and they wouldn't nest in a failed area of a crop field either. And so we're taking those failure-prone areas in the crop field out of crop production. They weren't growing crops before because they were consistently flooding. Now they're growing grass, and along with that grass, they're growing 22 species or more of breeding birds. Many of these birds are species of greatest conservation need or economically important. The economically important one on here, of course, is the ringneck pheasant. And that means people could go out there and go hunting with their friends and family, or allow the neighbors to take their kids out hunting in the field as a totally new opportunity area in the field. And then also some of these birds are what we call species of greatest conservation need, like the bobolink or the eastern kingbird or the eastern meadowlark, all species that we've seen declines in their populations in Iowa, and we're looking for ways to bring their populations back. In these wet areas and crop fields may provide us a really exciting opportunity to do just that. And so this is kind of a neat outcome and illustrates the win-win nature of these patches within our crop fields. The other exciting thing that we find when we go into these areas is that there's milkweeds all over, and there's flowering plants all over. And in case you've been living under a rock for the last few years, we know that those are really important for this other conservation challenge that we have in agricultural landscapes, and that's the monarch butterfly, who rely on the milkweeds for the host plant for their larvae and nectar sources for the adults to fly around when they're laying eggs and producing those larvae, or eventually for all the adults from Iowa into the north to migrate through Iowa on their way to that mountainside of Mexico where they spend their winter. And so what we find in these fields is that about every 15 feet we were finding a milkweed plant, and there was over 60 milkweeds per acre. And when we compare that to all the work that's been done to try to estimate how many milkweeds we need and where we can put them to help the monarch butterfly from becoming endangered, 60 milkweeds per acre in wet areas is exactly what we actually anticipate finding. So it's good outcome. It means that these areas really are good for monarchs. And then the other thing is that we monitored from May to August flower resources for adult monarchs or bees or other pollinating insects. And we find that there's one flower every 20 feet on average during that period. Of course, there's more later in the year and fewer earlier, and over 35 flowers per acre. So here again, these areas are providing really good resources for pollinators, including the monarch butterfly and a bunch of other species that we're interested in conserving in our agricultural landscapes. Another illustration of the win-win nature of these practices. So just to sort of account for all these benefits that we've sort of identified in this watershed-based approach where neighbors are finding opportunity areas to put perennial vegetation into their row crop fields, here's how I would sort of account for the benefits. The advantages to the farmer. It increases whole field profitability and productivity. If you take those low yielding areas out and stop putting inputs into them, the return on your investment on all the remaining acres increases. And so it increases profitability of the field. It adapts to the challenges that we're seeing with changing climate, where we do tend to see high intensity rainfall events early in the growing season that can lead to pooling of water in these areas, creating challenges with planting timing or trafficability in the field, or leading to the crop failure that we talked about as a way to identify these areas. And so it's an advantage there where you just aren't worrying about these areas. You aren't worrying about the drainage challenges there. You aren't worrying about whether or not they're limiting your ability to get into the field in the spring. And then finally, of course, it just reduces uncertainty. You know, by focusing on those profitable acres that year after year you're going to have less uncertainty related to environmental conditions and other things you can't control. The advantages to the landowner, and we find in this case study a number of arrangements, both owner-operated and leased land, and there's advantages, of course, just to the landowner. One, take these marginal areas and you can assure a regular income through the Conservation Reserve Program by enrolling those areas there. Two, you're growing soil health. By putting them into perennial vegetation, you're not saying you can't ever farm them again or anything like that. You're just essentially deferring future land use, and in doing so, you're protecting those soils with perennial vegetation that have deep roots and promote biological activity in the soil, and it essentially improving your land asset while you're taking this land out of row crop production. And then finally, I already mentioned, these are the hardest areas to drain in the field in most cases, and so you're reducing the drainage needs and reducing maintenance related to drainage infrastructure in these real problem areas. And then finally, I like to say advantages for everybody, because everybody relies on our farmers and landowners to provide habitat for wildlife that we all value and benefit from, and to provide clean water quality, like in this case to the Des Moines River that goes downstream to lots of communities downstream. And we know putting these wet spots and crop fields into native perennial vegetation will improve water quality downstream, and also potentially reduce flooding challenges as well. So as I mentioned, this is a win-win for the farmer, the landowner, and everybody else when we think about these creative redesigning of the field edges in our crop fields. So in wrapping this up, we wanted to talk about what the takeaways from all of our case studies were. And so because I'm the last one to present to you today, I'm the one that has to present sort of our key takeaways. And here I'm basically trying to speak to the themes that Catherine introduced, Billy introduced, and I introduced in our 3 case studies, and what we sort of think as natural resource professionals are the things for you to reflect on that you can apply in your own operation. So first, I've been saying this over and over again in my case study, and Billy and Catherine both talked about it in theirs, and that is we really want to find these win-win areas where you can work with nature to improve your outcomes on the farm. So in my case study, that was not fighting the challenge of drainage in those really wet areas, and instead just working with nature to put those into native perennial vegetation and farm around them. In Billy's case study, there was creative uses of trees to benefit the livestock production. And in Catherine's, it's, for example, mimicking natural processes by having continuous living cover in row crop fields year-round through the use of cover crops. So working with nature to improve farm profitability and farm resiliency. The next one is each one of us talked about this marginal business. Billy talked about riparian areas, and Catherine talked about riparian areas and wet spots, and then mine focused really on wet spots. Every farm has marginal acres that are not productive for crop production, and we want to rethink the uses of those rather than just keep trying to get a crop off of those in rare years. We want to rethink those, think about how they could be good for stewardship of wildlife resources, water resources, and also improving a lot of aspects of the farm operations. The next one is we all talked about financial incentives and technical expertise that's available through the Farm Services Agency, NRCS, Iowa Department of Ag and Land Stewardship, Iowa DNR, nonprofit organizations like Pheasants Forever, and a bunch of others that are out there. And those people are in your community and can help you, one, rethink some of the opportunities that you have on your farm for integrating more conservation practices, and then importantly, provide you with financial incentives or cost share to help you integrate those practices onto your farm. In some cases, that may just be like an upfront payment, like with EQIP, the Environmental Qualities Incentives Program, or it might be a long-term rental rate payment like we see with Conservation Reserve Program, tree plantings, or enrolling those wet areas in crop fields or along riparian areas. And then finally, I think you'll really see this in our 3 different case studies. No one-size-fits-all approach. Everybody is sort of trying to find the environmental stewardship practices that fit their farm operation and fit the way that the production goals that they have, the nature of the landscape, whether you're on the Des Moines lobe or off, in a floodplain or on the hilltops. Every farm is different. That's the advantage of working with those local experts and tinkering along the margins of your farm to think about how it is that you could introduce more natural infrastructure or resilient conservation practices that can improve farm profitability and environmental outcomes there. If you think about these things and think creatively about how you're going to approach land stewardship on your farm, hopefully downstream neighbors will benefit and you'll benefit as well. So we hope we gave you a few things to think about. Here's some our email addresses from all the people you just heard from today. Please let us know if you have any questions or how we could help on these matters. And thanks a lot for your time.